On this episode of Empowered Returns, we're diving into one of the most debated topics in housing policy, rent control. Joining us today is Dr. Christina Stacy of the Urban Institute, a leading researcher who's using machine learning to break down how rent control policies are really playing out across U.S. cities. From their surprising impact on extremely low-income renters to the unintended consequences for new housing supply, we're exploring the trade-offs every policymaker and developer should understand. Stay tuned for a data-driven look at how rent control, as well as other housing policies, including zoning, construction costs, transit, and other factors, affect affordability, development, and the future of our cities. Welcome to another episode of Empowered Returns. I am here today with Dr. Christina Stacy from the Urban Institute. And I was excited to talk to you, Tina, I believe you go by, about your recent study, an economics report that just came out in the Journal of Housing Economics about rent control and the supply of affordable housing, which is I think a topic that's near and dear to sort of anyone who is in the real estate market, in the development market, or frankly, just the public at large these days. So I was really excited to read your research, which has some innovative, ways of going about looking at rent control and the effects of rent control. But I'm excited to dive in with you. But as we go, so welcome first of all, and second of all, maybe you just want to give a quick potted bio of who you are and maybe a little bit about the Urban Institute as well.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here. It's such an important topic to talk about and to really kind of get some of the nuance in there, because I think people have very strong feelings one way or the other about rent control, and there's a lot of components of it, and it's not always as simple as yes or no, as is the case with most policies. My name's Tina Stacy. I'm a principal research associate at the Urban Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization located in Washington, D.C. Our goal is to elevate the debate in policy discussions, meaning infusing data and evidence into decision making at the state, local, all levels, really, community level even. I'm really excited to be here and talk about the work.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the background. I think, really there is an amazing degree of importance on this issue in terms of, price of housing and how housing is built and developed and, restricted in certain cases and what some of the ramifications of all that is. So I was really attracted to your study. I think you mentioned the word nuance a second ago. I think the really impressive thing about your study was that it did have that nuance. It really was almost like a meta-analysis type of approach, if that's, maybe not the right word to use, but sort of this you looking at multiple cities and municipalities, multiple policies, and how that might, really drive different effects. But maybe if you want to just give us a quick background of how you thought about and came about doing a study like this and what the methodology was at a high level.
Yeah, absolutely. We were really interested in studying this topic since especially since COVID and the recession that followed COVID, that a lot of localities have been in states, and even, we saw some federal proposals around rent control policies. A lot of places have been adopting these regulations. And a lot of the research, there's a lot of great research out there on rent control, but it's often only looking at one or two places at a time. And we know rent control can vary widely in its design from place to place, but also depending on what the place is like, the same policy could have differential impacts, right? If you're putting it in a place that has really quickly appreciating rents versus a place that doesn't, you might see different impacts. So we really wanted to conduct a study that looked across all different types, because, from these previous studies, you'll have one saying it does this, another saying it does this, and you don't know whether that's because of methodological differences or because it's a different city or a different policy. And so we just want to say, on average, across all the reforms that we've seen related to rent control within the time period that we're able to study, what general impact does it have on housing supply and housing affordability? There are, of course, limitations, right? Because we don't know whether this is driven by like the really strict policies or the looser ones, but we thought it would be a helpful kind of high-level attempt at kind of trying to summarize some of the overall impacts. Another thing that we wanted to do was update some of the research, because a lot of the newer policies we're seeing are very different from most of the policies that the previous research had studied, which completely exempted new construction from rent control, right? A lot of the newer policies we're seeing either exempt units based on exempt units based on a rolling basis, or don't exempt any units, right? And so that could have very different impacts on housing supply than prior iterations of the policy had. So we really wanted to look and see whether there were different types of impacts in more recent years.
Yeah, and one of the other interesting things that at least struck me was how you tried to stratify the different income levels and different levels of affordable housing, which I thought was really unique and interesting. Did you have a mindset going in there really to try to dig into the various levels of again going back to that nuance, how it affected different types of affordable housing or ranges?
Yeah, absolutely. Because even if we could say, overall, we know that we could look at, say the impact of rent control and overall housing supply, it might be that some places are okay with having less overall supply as long as they get more affordable units. And so we really wanted to be able to look at that distribution of impacts across the affordability spectrum. With one huge caveat being, though, that because rent control is not means tested, we don't know whether those affordable units are actually occupied by people of that income level. So I think future research, it would be great if future studies could really look into that question as well. But at least we can say, okay, we're seeing this number of units that theoretically could be affordable to a household that's low income, very low income, extremely low income, in that way. So we can kind of look at the distribution.
Yeah, I think that's one of the bugaboos you hear from sort of scientists and researchers everywhere, that the headline gets grasped out of the study, but you don't sort of miss that nuance or caveats or what the limitations of any given study is, or and it's fascinating to see. And so that, again, that's why I really wanted to dive in deep with you here today and really understand what some of these trade-offs and caveats may be in any given study, and how it impacts or may impact, or policymakers may think about how it might impact their specific policies in municipalities or states. So maybe we can just dive into that. What were the primary findings of the study?
No, yeah, absolutely. So we actually kind of found what we kind of had hypothesized we might see, although not at the same level. So our main finding is that we did find that on average, rent control can reduce the overall supply of rental housing within a municipality, right, within a city. But interestingly, we found that there, even though there was this overall reduction in supply, that on average there was an increase in the number of units affordable to people making extremely low incomes, right? So people at 30% or less of the area median income, so extremely low income households. So it just really points to this trade-off that policymakers might be considering when thinking about this. What are your overall goals? What are your needs in your community? And I mean, it really highlighted that tough trade-off that leaders would have to make when considering this kind of policy.
Yeah. So basically, just to summarize, so I make sure I understand as well. So the overall supply of housing decreased overall, but as a subsection of that, the supply of housing for the lowest sort of strata of incomes, that below 30% area median income, is that right? That actually that increased supply for that level of housing.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. But and makes sense. Yeah. And so would that also imply that the supply decreased for all the other brackets, so only increased in that one lowest level strata?
Actually, we saw the reduction happening at the top end.
Top end, okay.
Yeah, which kind of makes sense, right? You might expect that in places where new housing is not subject to rent control, that new housing is subject to rent control, that new housing might be less likely to be built, and generally new housing is more expensive, right? A lot of supply that's lost through rent control, though, from previous studies, we know comes from condo conversion, so converting rental units into condos. So you could very well see a reduction anywhere in the affordability spectrum due to condo conversions, but we did see a reduction in the high cost units.
Interesting. And so what are some of the implications that you might think about from this, or and you may even want to sort of think about how does it, you mentioned a little bit of the caveats there. You don't know whether or not the specific houses at specific strata levels actually is serving the people that need it or not, but that's one sort of caveat. But given that, what would this imply to you in terms of some of the implications of rent control policy, and that maybe policymakers should think about how to go about either not implementing it or implementing it or having discussions around it?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things, right? So we do know also from other work we've done and from prior studies that it really matters how it's designed, right? So there's the question of, is rent stabilization, rent control right for a place at all? And so I think, a leader might want to say, okay, well, we may have this overall reduction in supply if we implement an extremely aggressive form of rent control, but we might get this increase in units affordable to low income people. I would say you'd want to compare that against other policy options as well, like inclusionary zoning, where the units would be means tested and you would be sure that somebody with lower incomes would be in those units. But there's also options for combining rent stabilization, rent control with other policies, right? So if we think that rent control reduces overall supply and we're concerned about that, well, then you could add on companion policies like streamlining permitting processes, reducing fees, making it easier and quicker and cheaper for people to build. So that might be able to offset some of those costs to that lost revenue to developers. There's also places that have been testing out methods of incentivized rent control. So rather than forcing landlords to rent at a certain, allowing their rents to increase at a certain rate, offering them tax breaks or other incentives to do so. So then in that case, we might think we might not see that negative impact on supply, but you could still get some of those benefits of the slower increase in rent.
Yeah, and so actually, one of the mayoral candidates in Boston now has proposed a plan similar to that, which is a tax incentive, an option, opt-in rent control or rent stabilization plan with some tax incentives that I think I have a question for later down the road. But it's interesting to see how these different rent control doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? Or any of these policies don't operate in a vacuum, and so I know you mentioned inclusionary zoning among other things, permitting process, entitlements process, just frankly cost to build and construction costs. And I think from a developer's perspective, they would say, like, look, all we're seeing oftentimes is these things that continue to add cost or make it more difficult to build, adding and making it more challenging. And then you're also saying, okay, we want to layer on rent control. And that really scares off or crowds out the investment in a given market in many cases, at least what we've seen anecdotally. Again, you're the one doing the really deep research here. But have you sort of seen or heard similar types of things?
Definitely. I mean, I remember in a prior study, we were doing interviews with developers and landlords about rent control and inclusionary zoning, actually. And we talked with one person who was both a developer and a landlord. And he had this great quote of something like, 40 years ago when I started doing this, I could go into the county office and get a permit in 30 minutes for $25 and 3 pages of documentation. And now it costs me thousands of dollars, takes 6 months, and is like 400-page document. And so all of those things that add up, and he's kind of like, at some point it's the straw that breaks the camel's back of like this requirement on top of this requirement on this top of this requirement. And not saying that none of those requirements are valid, right? Like a lot of the rules we have in place are for safety and security and things like that. But I think trying to find that better balance of keeping in the necessary rules and regulations and processes, but streamlining them so it's not so expensive to build in our nation is hugely important. And rent control could very well have a role within that system, but I think you want to think about the potential negatives that could come from any policy. Even inclusionary zoning, if it's mandatory, could have some negative supply impacts, right? And so thinking about how can we balance those out, or even really, I think we might need to go beyond just balancing at this point and really making development easier altogether. But you can still design, I think, rent control in a way that makes sense, if it does make sense for your community, in partnership with other policies that are going to help with these other issues.
Yeah, so it raises kind of a question for me as well when you just mentioned if it works for your municipality. How do you take, and have you done research that maybe wasn't specific to this, but about the regionalization? I mean, everyone says real estate's local, real estate local. It's oftentimes municipality driven. Zoning is, oftentimes here in Massachusetts for sure, city by city and not even county by county. So it adds a lot of challenges when there's different policies even a few miles apart. So did this study look at that, or have you looked at that in the past and how that might be considered by policymakers in the future?
We didn't look at that directly, but that's certainly something we've worked on. I helped do some of the background research for Prince George's County's recent rent stabilization policy, and Montgomery County nearby also had recently implemented a rent stabilization policy. And, it's kind of easier when it's at that big county level, but of course you still have that. Developers could be saying, well, I could build here, or I can go a mile this way into the other county and build somewhere else. And I think it's certainly something to think about, and a huge challenge in the way that we run our cities, right? So any way we can get more regionalization in these types of policies, definitely better coordination. Not just that, but also with things like standardized land use laws and regulations. I know we also have done a lot of work on accessory dwelling unit regulations, and it's really hard as an ADU developer if every city has some sort of different rules about how big your hangover or your, like how far the setback has to be, where the windows, all those kinds of things, right? And so if you had standardization in those rules, it'd be much easier for those developers to be able to create lower cost units, come in and build them more quickly, and get more supply into the market to help with these issues. So I think regional coordination would be great. It's really hard. I mean, speaking of, being in DC, we've got two different states.
Yeah.
And then DC. And I mean, on top of all the different jurisdictions, it's really challenging. So the more you can get regional coordination around this, the better.
I'm glad you said that you're speaking my language. I've been on that soapbox for quite a while. I'm as a member of the City of Boston Zoning Commission. We've been working, and the city's been working on updating zoning. We have a 4,000-page zoning code in Boston alone, which is quite excessive in my opinion. Which makes it very, very difficult, very unpredictable. There's virtually nothing that can be built as of right, which again adds complexity and timing. And so the thought is, okay, let's now talk about rent control as a solution or inclusionary zoning as a solution. And in reality, there's no one magic bullet. This has to be a coordinated effort, not just with the different policies, but in my opinion, regionally as well, to make sure we're all working at the on the same page here with a lot of things. Because ultimately, I think everyone has the same goal. Everyone wants more affordable housing, more housing for people, really at all strata that needs it. It's a basic human need to have housing that is well maintained, can be affordable, and all these things. And so the question is, how do you get there? And that's what I really appreciated about sort of the approach you guys took here in terms of the nuanced approach to at least the rent control piece of it, and among the rest of your research that you guys do as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's actually an optimistic take on it, though, that everyone does want affordable housing. I think this layered in with this issue of all of the requirements that we have for getting something built, all of the processes, really also comes down to how many opportunities local residents have to block nearby developments as well. Mm-hmm. And that when something's not by right, there's often a lot of opportunities for that. And there is a lot of incentive for higher income homeowners who tend to be higher income to not necessarily want development nearby, right? Because of all of the reasons we're used to hearing, right? Strains on traffic and school crowding and those kinds of things. And so when we are able to try to rebalance that a bit, because homeowners are more likely to engage in community engagement processes around housing, and they're also much more likely to oppose it as compared to general population. The more we can rebalance those discussions to ensure that renters and other folks are engaged, or to just streamline the processes so it's easier overall, I think the easier it will be to build and solve this problem.
Yeah, good push. Thank you. Yeah, correct. I was sort of referring to more of at least people on the policy side versus the neighbor issue, right? That's a big issue in a lot of areas. And so I think the other challenge, though, and I agree with you, to get more people into the tent, so to speak, more people engaged. But I think one of the other challenges, though, and I think what you guys at the Urban Institute are trying to do effectively, is really provide that data-backed, research-backed approach to how and what is needed, because I think far too often, understandably, emotions get pulled into this, and there's this knee-jerk reaction to saying, even people who want affordable housing are against development in some cases because it's going to there's this idea of gentrification or other things that possibly could happen in various capacities, but oftentimes it's not a data-backed or researched or nuanced point of view. Do you come across that, or is that sort of one of the things you're trying to appeal to in your organization?
Absolutely. And I mean, even in cases where, we think we know what impact something might have very logically, it might, oftentimes we find the opposite when you empirically study it. And then when you dig in further, you can kind of tease out the mechanisms or the reasons why things aren't working quite as you might expect. And so I think it's really important to infuse data. And I do agree, like rent control tends to be a very kind of hot button issue. People get very emotional about it, but when you really step back and look at it, I think both sides that are often engaged in these discussions, that ensuring that the regulation isn't designed in such a way that overall supply goes down is a benefit to both sides, right? So when you're designing these laws, I think trying to, if a place decides to design such a law, and when they're having these discussions, trying to draw in those common goals and trying to get both sides, so both the tenant advocates and kind of the developer community, to see, okay, it's good for both sides if we can design this in such a way that we're kind of maximizing the affordability outcomes without harming the overall supply outcomes. Because I think on average, I would summarize the prior research, and our research is saying that rent control can be really great for people who are lucky enough to be in controlled units, but it can actually harm the people who aren't in those units. And because it's not means tested, that meaning that some of those folks that like the tenant right advocates are like representing could be harmed by this. And so I think ensuring that we can get folks to work together to design regulations that maximize those benefits for people in controlled units while minimizing the negative impacts on uncontrolled folks. We're all on we have the same goal, right? And so I think there are definitely a lot of design ways to, get to that balance.
And it's interesting too. I think your research brought up another, at least thought for me when it shows that rent control on average is helping to build or create more affordable housing at the lower levels, but less housing overall, and specifically on the higher end. And I worry that creates, really rapidly appreciating prices on the high end, and then you have the low end. You have this big bifurcation and hollowing out of anything in the middle or middle class. And I think that doesn't lead to great communities in most cases. I don't know if you have, any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think I would worry about that more with other kinds of policies, only because since it's not means tested, I guess on the supply side, that's true. What I worry about more with rent control and the supply impact is a filtering upward, which is the opposite of what we want, where higher income people are actually occupying units that are not at the quality or cost level that they would be willing to pay because there aren't any units at their willing price. So they're actually occupying those more affordable units and taking it away from people who need it. And so that kind of filtering up, if there isn't that overall supply and there's no means testing, could mean that even though we're seeing more affordable units, they might not be occupied by the people who are actually at that income level.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That's interesting. And I know, it's because we want to chat a little bit about filtering, and filtering you mentioned up and filtering. I think there's been some studies. I think the St. Louis Fed, it was that did the most recent one I saw that did a study on filtering and showed that actually by building more housing, that does lead to that, the people that can afford the more expensive housing choose to live in those because they're nicer, newer, and it allows for the lower price homes to be deoccupied by those people and then occupied by the people who need it. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on kind of filtering, how that works, if that type of study makes sense to you, and if that's an outcome you suspect should happen or would happen in other municipalities.
Yeah, I mean, that research was very promising, and all the new research on like the move change showing that like how, the actual filtering process by which a new unit becomes more affordable is very slow and long, right? It takes a long time. But the latest research showing that when new units come on, that these move changes that occur, where one person moves and then another moves and then another moves, that can actually filter down really quickly to affordable units and affordable neighborhoods, is very promising. So it's very exciting. I would say on average, we do have a lot of research showing that increases in supply can help with affordability. We don't have a lot of research showing that upzoning specifically can lead to that, because there are some complicating factors there. And so we definitely need more research in that area, but supply on average, and then other things like we've been talking about beyond the upzoning, just simplifying processes and making development cheaper, I think would definitely help as well. But it's never going to get you those deeply affordable units. So like you said, there's no silver bullet, and rent control is not an affordability policy, right? It's a rent growth. If rents are already unaffordable, rent control isn't going to make them affordable for a very long time. And perhaps never, depending on how it's designed, because most rent control policies have a vacancy decontrol rule whereby when a tenant moves out, the landlord can pop the rent up to market rate. And so if that's in place, you might never see those unaffordable units become affordable. So really these are all little pieces in a big puzzle of policies that need to be enacted to address affordability for all of our members of our communities, right? From deeply affordable up to higher income folks.
Yeah, and I think that just speaks to the complexity of building housing. It's really the ultimate team sport in so many ways, with so many different stakeholders, so many different jurisdictions, so many different investment protocols, investment needs from that side of things. So it's really challenging to get everyone on the same page. So that's why the work that you're doing with studies like this and other studies at the Urban Institute are so important. And I just want to make sure people are really trying to pay attention, especially policymakers, especially and frankly developers. And ideally, if we can get some of those NIMBY neighbors to even look at some of this stuff too, that helps in a lot of ways. But I do think it's amazing. What do you think? How do you guys try to get the word out there about your organization, and how are you consulting with policymakers or promoting your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have an amazing communications team who helps nerds like me figure out more like approachable ways of explaining our findings. So we have a great blog post called Urban Wire. Highly recommend it. It's great. They're short. You get the sound bites, the most important information from our studies in a very quick way, hopefully a more approachable, attainable method. We, of course, have our long reports and our long journal articles as well for anyone who wants to dig in more. But we try to do webinars, regular webinars. We have email listservs, but I would really recommend our blog as the quickest and best way to kind of get the best info from Urban. And we also have a lot of great work around data visualization features where you can have a website and you can go in and there'll be an interactive map where you can zoom in your own community and look at the data or findings for your community. So across a number of different topics, those are really great as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm glad I came across this study, and so I've been digging into a little bit of the website and different things. It's really fantastic. I would highly recommend it to any policymakers at frankly at any level, and neighbors or anyone that's curious about housing, and sort of the supply and affordability of housing overall. Just to kind of jump back into some other questions, and one is, I guess, if you look at, and this is, I'm going to reference the St. Paul. Specifically their rent control that they've sort of rolled back a little bit recently, if you're familiar with that. But I wonder, I use that as the backdrop of wondering, how does market conditions potentially impact how these policies work, or should potentially work at any given time? As you well know, it's really difficult to build from, whether it's construction costs, interest rates, the investment market overall. It's really difficult to get new construction into the ground and built these days. And so, how do policies, could they shift and change and morph in different economic times?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to consider where your locality is starting from. Like you said, if it's already really tough to build in a place, and you're considering rent control, work really hard to design the policy properly so that it keeps that balance between benefits for tenants versus negative impacts, benefits for controlled tenants versus negative impacts on the reverse supply. But also, like we said, thinking about considering other policies to maybe first address some of those constraints on development to begin with, or in tandem with a rent control kind of policy. So in Boston's case, like you said, since it's a really high demand, high cost city with substantial barriers to new housing construction, it does make it more vulnerable to those supply reduction impacts. And so the city should be aware and preparing for that if they are considering a rent control policy, and deciding what kind of policies and programs. And sometimes it doesn't even have to be policies, right? It can just be, improving the speed at which permits get processed or whatever, which I know sounds easy when I say it, but it can be. But other types of changes in implementation that could maybe complement this. I would also say one thing we haven't mentioned is that rent control can be very costly to implement, depending on where you fall on the spectrum of being very proactively enforcing rent control versus kind of letting it be like a tenant complaint based situation. if you're very proactive in enforcing it, meaning you have a rental registry, you know everybody's rents, you're ensuring and monitoring that no one's rents are going up beyond what's allowable, that can be extremely expensive. I mean, we've talked to localities where they have upwards of 15 full-time employees just to administer their rent control policy, right? So, but if you go on the other end of the extreme where it's very tenant-based, you really don't have much oversight, it can be cheaper, but it often isn't enforced, right? Tenants don't even know their rights. It's not being, landlords are just ignoring it, whatever it is, because there's no enforcement. And your most vulnerable tenants are likely to be the ones who are least likely to complain about illegal rent increases, right? They might be afraid of retaliation from their landlord. So really, as you're thinking about implementing a rent stabilization, rent control bill, I used that rent stabilization and control interchangeably. Rent stabilization is kind of the more like term du jour for it. Or an anti-gouging. We're seeing more anti-gouging bills, which are more really kind of just making sure that rents aren't going up at a really, really high rate, right? But just making sure you're thinking about how much this is going to cost you to implement it properly and considering alternative uses of those dollars, right? So would those dollars be better spent going into a housing trust fund and building permanently affordable or, somewhat permanently affordable housing, or, going into maybe eviction prevention programs and emergency rental assistance or things like that. So thinking about the opportunity costs of those dollars, I think is really important.
Yeah. Cool. Interesting. And so I don't know. I don't know if you've read they're doing a big media tour with Book Abundance. These guys, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, those guys, and talking about this concept of just especially in blue states and high cost areas, that these sort of 1,000 little paper cuts of regulations that are driving up costs to do a lot of things, from housing to green energy to transit and all these other stuff. So I don't know. I'll say that as the backdrop of wondering if you have a take on of all the policy tools or regulation, deregulation opportunities at a municipality or statewide proposal. Do you have a sense on which may be the most impactful fastest, or it's impossible to say? There's not enough research?
I mean, I can say my personal take, which I'm not sure how heavily it's evidence-based. I haven't empirically studied it myself, but I would say, judging from, and it's going to vary based on place, right? So every place might have different barriers that most affect it. But judging based on Minneapolis's experience as one of the first places to really do this, what people incorrectly call banning single-family zoning, which is not, you could still have single-family houses.
So it's amazing how the messaging continues to get tweaked for each side, right?
I shouldn't say that, but where they are allowing plexes on what was formerly zoned only single-family. My impression from the research, and both qualitative and quantitative, and from speaking with policymakers, is that they didn't really see a lot of impact from the initial upzoning. We're seeing this in other places as well. Those upzonings to allowing plexes, it doesn't really work if it's not financially viable to turn a single family home into a plex, right? So if it's not going to pencil for a developer, it's not going to work. What we heard did have more of an impact in Minneapolis's broader policy reforms around that time was reducing parking requirements. That is hugely expensive for developers, right? So, and in many places, they're not necessary, right? You see empty parking lots, empty parking garages. So really rethinking parking requirements, not just for large developments, for ADUs. Do you need to require an off-street parking spot, particularly if it's near transit? And then fees and timelines, right? Really rethinking, do we need all of those extra required? I know this is from Abundance. I have read that book, which I think is great, honestly, great book. I think it's getting misinterpreted a lot, but I mean, we still, and like we said, and what the argument they make in the book as well is they're not saying we should just cut them all and have no rules and build anything anywhere. We need some of these. We just need to rebalance it and think about what are really important. How can we streamline things, and how can we kind of get back to this balance of making it feasible? And then, I think a big thing, just to throw it in, that people don't talk about from Abundance enough, is that one of their big arguments is that we need the government to be supporting innovation. And innovation in housing construction, most other industries have increased innovation over the past century or so, right? Housing, there are some arguments that housing has negatively innovated in the past
Yeah.
50 to 100 years, right? And we need government support to innovate. We need more improvements in manufactured housing. We need more ability to improve the ways in which we're able to build our houses, right? To allow for innovation in housing construction and design. So I think we're not saying that we don't need government intervention, as we do. We need government support, but we just really need to rethink this process through which there's so many pieces of it.
Yeah, I love the passion. By the way, it's great, and I agree with almost everything you just said. And there's a few examples to go back to in a second. But I always come back to the fact that I think there's this unfortunate conflict between the idea that developers are so greedy, profit driven, and not like someone who is there to supply new housing. It's like I've used the term, we don't treat farmers like they're just out to make a profit. They're providing this really important need. It's totally different thing, and not the best metaphor in the world. But like, I just feel like, why is this dichotomy between, you have this group of people who are the suppliers of new housing, and so we constantly making it harder and more difficult, rather than the things you just said, like encouraging innovation, helping lower cost of construction, and with whatever methodology it is. But I think, at least my take on that is, it comes from this idea that there's this developers are greedy and profit driven. They don't really care about communities as much as the rest of us type of mindset. That is the sort of root cause of some of that. I'm not saying it's totally it, but that's one thing. But to go back to another point you made about the parking thing, yeah, I'm on that soapbox right there with you. I think there's way too much parking being built. I think the data shows it as well. A lot of multifamily parking garages that are 33% full and not full, and they were required to build full garages within a quarter mile of a train station. And so, and anecdotally, even you've seen in Boston here, there was a new project, a 70-unit housing project that was slated to be built, but it was trying to get entitled with zero parking. And it's within a quarter mile of 2 train stations, and it was denied permits because, in large part because the neighbors are complaining about the problem with parking and overcrowding street parking. And it's like, well, at some point we've got to build for people and not cars, right? And also at some point we have to say this is a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing. Yeah, so like a lot of people still have and drive cars because we still provide parking and garages. Whereas if we didn't do that, you'd be attracting the people who want to live in these environments, have walkable, transit-oriented, and be more likely to use those transit options. And so, that's a big challenge. But parking is almost an immediate positive benefit to housing supply, the way I see it, the way the data that I've seen, for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, this does point to a good point that we also need investments in transit, and unfortunately, that's looking like more and more of a challenge. But I often hear people in the transportation realm say housing is often the best transportation solution, and so that's another area in which regional planning, not just across jurisdictions, but across different types of kind of field. So housing and transportation, just absolutely, there's so much opportunity for those groups of policymakers and practitioners to work together more to identify solutions, right? And then you get solutions well beyond, or you get benefits well beyond just the affordability of housing. You get climate benefits, right? If you can reduce vehicle miles traveled and have more transit, you get more access to opportunity for people with low incomes if they're able to be near good transit and get to good jobs. So, I mean, I think that's why it's so important to think about rent control in a big policy continuum, not just of other housing policies, but also transportation policies and investment, and many others as well. Also economic development policy, where you're incentivizing and helping businesses grow and thrive.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And I think one of the other big things that have sort of on my radar and on my soapbox is some of the ways we build housing now is, in terms of like needing 2 means of egresses versus 1 means, and some, like you see in a lot of European cities and even older buildings in cities like Boston and San Francisco, whereas nowadays you could never build the same thing. And, adding a second stairway, second means of egress, again, in theory, that is maybe considered safer. That's why it came into play. But the question is, given today's building technology, and is it really just adding unnecessary cost of construction? And we need to sort of go back and understand like what the building materials are today that are so much safer that might be accommodating those safety needs instead of a second means of egress. Is that another factor that you see is playing into the supply of housing, cost of housing?
Absolutely. And that's definitely not my area of expertise. So I don't want to speak like an expert, but there is great research looking at all the potential benefits of other types of, rather than having form-based codes, having, I'm blanking on the term, but it's like outcomes-based, talking about performance-based codes, which allow builders to innovate more. And instead of saying, okay, here's 2 ways you're allowed to put 2 walls together, there's like 2 approved joints. It's like you can use anything you want as long as it performs at a safe standard after it's done. Again, not my area of expertise, but I think that's another huge thing that our nation needs to step back and look at. And like you said, all of these layered on requirements, elevators can be extremely expensive, things like that. So I think it would be good for us to be able to, rather than, piecemeal, like the way we see most of our zoning codes written, where it's just pieces added to the point where it's really hard, even for an expert, to be able to say, what are you allowed to build in this neighborhood? Because you have to go through 52 different like subcodes to figure it out. And rather than continuing to create policy in a way that slightly adds on or modifies, really take a step back and structurally look at the whole system, look at the whole zoning code. Is there a way to like simplify the whole thing and put it together in a way that makes more sense? And then also step back and look at the whole process, the whole development process, all of the steps that it takes to get something built, and think about where there might be unnecessary steps. And I think Massachusetts is a really interesting case with 40B, whereby affordable housing developers can kind of skip some of those steps and have a streamlined permitting process if their city falls within. I won't go into the details of 40B, but I'm sure all your listeners know it very well. But that's an interesting experiment, right? Where you can see how much quicker things can go if you have streamlined processes. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to kind of step back and look big picture holistically at the whole system and see how are you creating a system that allows developers to build units at different affordability levels, but also supports development, deeply affordable units, because those are almost never going to be created through the private market, right? Because it's expensive to build and you don't get a lot of rent from them, right? So you need to support those.
Look, I think this has been a great conversation, Tina, and I think it speaks to the fact we started with rent control, and you're really, a very, very interesting and detailed survey, or study rather, that really surveyed a lot of different markets and brought a lot of findings to the table that are, I think, important for all of us to look at. But just knowing that that's just really one piece of the whole puzzle of this housing affordability development puzzle that I think we've covered in pretty wide ground here, which is exciting. But I appreciate all of your input and all of the work you guys do at the Urban Institute, and I will certainly be paying more and more attention and forwarding along your work to a lot of folks in the industry and a lot of policymakers to make sure we're all really. For me, it's so important to go back to that data-driven, research-driven, empirical information and trying to remove the knee-jerk sort of emotional takes that so many people often have, which, again, around a critical need of housing makes sense, is fair, I understand it, but we have to try to take a step back and develop policy at a higher level, I think, to make it make sense across the board. But so thank you very much, Tina. Is there anything that you have to add or final thoughts before we check out here?
No, I mean, this has been great. Thank you. One thing we didn't go into, but I'm happy to chat with any of your listeners about one-on-one, is the actual specifics of designing a rent stabilization, rent control policy.
Sure.
There's so many different pieces that go into it. We've done a lot of work on that as well. So if anyone needs help with that, we often work with local leaders to help kind of design policies in a way that might balance all of these goals. So, but this is great. It was so great speaking with you. It was lovely to be here.
Awesome. Great to speak with you, Tina. And we'll certainly in the show notes and on the links, we'll link to your contact info and everything else as well, so people can get in touch if they would like to. But Tina, thank you for your time, and hopefully everyone got a lot of takeaways from this episode of Empowered Returns.
Thanks
so much.
Tina.